Okay, welcome. So for the first time, we're expanding outside of the US today. We're going to be talking about global perspectives, water resilience, focusing on Southeast Asia. And with this, I wanted to introduce one of the partners here who has been instrumental in this panel as well as part of this conference from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, Amanda Stout, who's the Senior Director of Climate Crossroads. So with that, thank you, Amanda, and pass to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. I am Amanda Stout. I direct our Climate Crossroads work at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And thank you all for joining us, both those of you in the room and those of you joining us online. And we're really grateful to Science Water and to Columbia for hosting this with us and bringing this conference together. We're really excited to partner with them. We are sort of incorporating this as part of a webinar series that we've held for more than 3 years. So we have a large online audience as well that we're bringing to this event today. So thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know the National Academies, we were founded in 1863, so we're 161 years old. We've had a lot of mentions of how old organizations are. And we have been addressing climate change for many, many decades. In fact, one of our earliest reports came out in 1879 and looked at the variation in hydrology between the eastern and western parts of the United States and recommended the formation of the U.S. Geological Survey. So we helped get that started in 1879. So I am very excited to be here today to introduce our conversation on water resilience through a global lens. Much like our Earth's climate, water is not confined to our human-made boundaries, and almost every region in the world is confronting a range of challenges around water security, especially in the context of rapidly changing climate. Also, this gives us a really nice opportunity to learn from each other. Today, we're going to focus in on India. And as we will hear, India is experiencing rapid economic growth and an increasing demand for natural resources. And water insecurity in the country has compounding and cascading impacts, both regionally and globally, presenting big policy challenges and opportunities. Similarly to the United States, the diversity in geographies, cultures, and the need to localize policy solutions showcase how much we can learn from one another. So that's why I'm thrilled today to have an esteemed panel of speakers who have experience across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to lead the discussion. I'll bring them up in just a minute. I wanted to give a little bit more background about this discussion series. So this is part of our Ramanathan Climate Series Conversations, which is an annual event that the National Academy of Sciences hosts in honor of our member of the Academies, Veerbhadradran Ramanathan. And it was made possible by a generous support provided by Sunandu Basu. So we do have something like 700 people registered for the live stream, so we're really glad to have all of you here. And recognizing that this is a global challenge, the Ramanathan Climate Conversation Series focuses on climate resilience in South and East Asia, aiming to identify pathways to action relevant to viewers and policymakers around the world. All right, so we actually have 2 back-to-back sessions for you. So we're going to do like 45 minutes of discussion, a short break for those of you who might want to switch up to other breakout sessions or for others to come in, and then we'll continue with a second 45-minute session. The way we're going to run it is we're going to have a discussion with the panelists for about 30 minutes, where we'll address the current state of water resource management in India, and then we'll break for some Q&A, and we'll invite questions from both our in-person and our virtual audience. And then we'll return in part 2 to explore emerging solutions and financing for water resilience, and again, have some time for audience Q&A. All right, so with that, I am very pleased to introduce our moderator for today, John Matthews. John is the co-founder and executive director of the Alliance of Global Water Adaptation, where he has pioneered new climate risk reduction and resilience building methodologies and influenced climate strategies in more than 100 countries. It's pretty impressive. And as a leader in climate adaptation and resilience since 2007, John's work has facilitated more than $20 billion in water resilience investments globally and he continues to shape national and corporate resilience planning. So thank you again for joining us, and over to you, John. And I think we can invite our other panelists to come up too at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and I'm really grateful to be asked to moderate such a special session. South Asia in general and India in particular has been a really important part of my work over the last 17 years or so. I've been really grateful to learn so much from Indian colleagues, and I think actually, especially as someone from the U.S., I think that the U.S. really needs to learn enormously from India now. The space of water and resilience is a flat space. That actually we have lessons that we need to be looking out across the planet. And India is for this century, I think it's going to be one of the great partners for the U.S. Actually, maybe you've heard about the Quad, the kind of emerging geopolitical partnership in Asia, and India and the U.S. are really at the cornerstone of the Quad. So we may be talking about India, but I really hope, even if you don't work in India, that you're going to bring your U.S. thinking, your U.S. sensibilities to this space. For some reason, I feel like India is very underreported in the U.S., and I think that's a serious loss because we have so much that's in common. We share so many citizens. I think we have a culture that's moving together too. And there's so many issues that are present in India that are deeply, deeply relevant. Two very quick stories on my side. I was working a few years ago in South Asia on behalf of the UK government, and I was meeting with a deputy state minister, and he worked in energy, and we walked in to his office, and he said, you and your colleague, you're both greenies, right? Like you're here to talk with me about ecosystems. And I want to tell you, actually, we're not that interested in the energy ministry, in ecosystems. My colleague and I were both ecologists. We kind of winked at each other, and she said, we don't really care about ecosystems either. The deputy minister said, I'm really surprised by that, but you must be here instead to talk about carbon. And my colleague and I looked at each other, and we winked again at each other, and she said, well, actually, we don't care that much about carbon either. We were really hoping that someone was not taping us for the UK at that moment, since they were paying our bills. Then the deputy minister was so surprised, he said, well, why the hell are you here? And I jumped in and I said, you're building a brand new thermal energy plant here, right? And he said, yes, of course. It's one of the primary investments that you're doing in this state. And he said, what about it? I said, where's the water come from for it? It's a water-cooled system. But where's the water come from? He said, it comes from a canal. I said, it doesn't come from a canal. It comes from a glacier. It comes from a transboundary glacier. It's a glacier that actually is in rapid evolution right now. And you share it with neighbors that their interests may be changing over time. There are probably 60 million farmers in this state. And I want to know when you go to your minister and you say, I need the water for energy, who's he going to listen to? The farmers? Is he going to listen to you? And he got really quiet and he said, I think I know why you're here. That's an example that should ring true for the US too. Like we're in an era of new trade-offs. And we need to open up our sample space in terms of who it is that we're looking at, that we're learning from, that we're partnering with. And in that sense, I think that's what's at stake today. So I'm really grateful. I want to start off by introducing my colleagues here on the panel. Longtime colleague, Upmanu Lall, that I'm going to call him Manu, He currently serves as the founding director of the Water Institute of the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Lab. It's a new program at Arizona State University designed to predict and address water challenges from community to national to global scales. He previously served as the founding director here at the Columbia Water Center. That's where we met, I think. Also going to hear from Veena Srinivasan. She founded Well Labs, Well, W-E-L-L, Water, Environment, Land, and Livelihoods Lab. She has joined us from Bangalore and brings a mission to bring the best available data and science to create transformational impact at scale. Well Labs curates solutions and builds the ecosystem of actors to improve human well-being and conserve the environment. And then Rochi, also a longtime colleague, Rochi Khemka. She serves as a senior private sector specialist with the World Bank's 2030 Water Resources Group. It's the part of the World Bank that doesn't just fund governments, especially national governments, but also creates synergies and partnerships with the private sector. It's a very interesting part of the bank with a water-centric focus. She focuses on water security. She has a background in private sector development and financing at the global level and across multiple countries in South Asia. And I think you just moved from Delhi to DC, right? Yeah, cool. Great. Well, this first part, up until the break, we're going to be focusing on what are the kind of landscape level issues that we're thinking about in India. Like, what are the big issues, maybe some of the big opportunities too that we should be thinking about. And then we're going to turn to a little bit more into the two of the key words in this session, water and resilience. What do they really mean? Are we talking about a new term for things that we've already been doing? Are we thinking about doing something that actually represents a break from the past? Those are really important and critical issues. So, and I'm trying to reattach to my iPad. So I'm going to turn with the first question. I'm going to go to Veena first, and then I'm going to go to Manu. And for the second set of questions, I'm going to turn to Rochi. So Veena, I'm curious, what do you see from your perspective in Bangalore at Well Labs? What do you see as some of the kind of major vulnerabilities, some of the emerging risks in the water space in India?
Thank you so much, John, as well as the National Academy of Sciences for inviting me. It's been a real interesting, I had the pleasure of attending the last two sessions and listening to mostly US-based water issues, which I don't get a chance to that much. So firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to contrast between US and India because I see a lot of the audience here might not be familiar with the Indian context. So firstly, India is very geographically diverse. We've got, the mountains, we've got the very, very wet areas, we've got deserts. And so it's important to realize that when I speak about India, I'm painting with a very, very broad brush. But I think overall people have kind of described India's problems as with any other part of the world, there's too much, too little, and too polluted all at once. And so that's kind of fundamentally the problem that we're confronting, which is we are dependent on a monsoonal climate. A lot of our water falls as rain in the span of a few months, in some places in a few days. And really, you got to make that work for the rest of the year in a place that's very hot and crowded. And so you have to find places to store the water, and that's kind of the challenge that we have. Now, I think the other thing that really struck me from the conversation in the two panels before this was in the US, a lot of the infrastructure has already been built, and it's aging, and we're really talking about how do we kind of rejuvenate or refurbish the infrastructure to kind of serve the needs of the 21st century. In India, we have aging infrastructure. A lot of our infrastructure was built in colonial times in big cities, but we're also growing really, really fast. And roughly, the estimate is that a population about the size of the entire US will be added to Indian cities in the next 20 years. And so we're talking about a lot of greenfield development, even as we're talking about sustaining and refurbishing our existing infrastructure. So that's immediately a different context because one of the questions that really strikes when we hear the discussion before is, if we didn't have all this infrastructure and we were designing every single thing from scratch, which with today's technologies, would we still do it the same way? And I think that the answer is maybe not, because the opportunities and the innovations in the water sector are pointing out to us being able to do very different things. We just can't do it in places where the infrastructure is already built and there's a sunk cost of capital that exists, and therefore you can only do incremental things. Just a couple of points about ag. We didn't hear much about ag, though. Like the US, India has about 80% of our water actually goes to agriculture, similar to the US, but unlike the US, 60% of our voting population is engaged in agriculture, which means that a lot of our policies around water are built to favor 60% of the population, of course, justifiably so. But that's a very, very distinct difference from the US, which means we have, firstly, unlike what the previous panel said, water is a politically salient topic in India, which means elections are won and lost on water, which is not the case here. I mean, we saw the thing about how you can get to bipartisanship in the US, because that's not the case. But that means that some of the problems that we have in India have deep underlying political will issues, like free electricity. So electricity for agriculture is free in India. That is 80% of our total water use. So 80% of water use is agriculture, and 80% of ag water use is groundwater, and groundwater is free. And this means that a large part of our food production in the country comes from essentially mining fossil water. And the big concern then that we're going to have over the next 20 years is all those hotspots of groundwater depletion that we realize are big threats to the economy in terms of both drinking water industry and ag, and where they're going to get water from, but they have very deep political roots in terms of it can't be undone. The entitlements can't be undone easily. So I'll stop there, but I think there's lots of ways in which India is similar but also different.
That's true, but I would also add, the groundwater, for instance, is a huge issue, especially in the western U.S. And one of the things that I was really struck in one conversation I was having in India, I was talking to a hydrologist, and he said, gosh, the British really screwed us with their water governance. The laws that were transferred from Great Britain to India, they just don't work here. And I said, well, they screwed us pretty good on it too. So I think that's actually something that we share. And in that sense, these issues around consumption are actually maybe more consistent. But you're right. I mean, this idea that actually politicians have to be sensitive about constituencies. And in the previous panel, water utilities are not a strong constituency, but farmers who are seeking, especially smallholder farmers, who are seeking water for their systems, that is a very powerful one, with that 60% of the population. Manu, my label for you in my mind is one of a very practical but great thinker in the space of water and climate, and someone who's intensely aware of both the science and the kind of options for practice, for engineering, for governance and finance. From your perspective, how do you see climate change altering the landscape? What are the things that maybe we feel strongly right now in India, or that we should be aware of as kind of emerging sensitivities?
Thanks, John. Very kind also to say those kind of things. I have to think a bit about your question, and I should be already prepared, right, because you sent it. The reason I have to think about it is the framing is climate change. Is that really the valid framing in the Indian context? This is a place where the monsoon is the most defining feature. And the monsoon, for people who have not experienced it, is not something you'll understand. If you have gone to a waterfall and wondered if you could stand under a waterfall, this is one facet of the monsoon. The other facet of the monsoon is it's gone many times, and then it comes back. So when we started working in India on groundwater depletion in the north, the framing was the agricultural framing. These people are sucking up all the water. What can you do about it? And one of the initial analyses I did to try to understand the climate framing of this issue was interesting. Thanks to the British, we've got to give them some thanks. There's one of the longest time series of rainfall in the world is available in India. So if you just look at that, no fancy imputations or anything like that, what you find is that the period in which the Green Revolution took off in India, which is 1965 to 2000, is actually an anomaly. It's one of the wettest periods in that entire period. And what we have gone to in the period where we have now significant groundwater depletion is a drier period since 1995. But that period since 1995 really looks more like 1850 through 1965. So it's one of these accidents of nature that you end up juxtaposing innovation in agriculture with a wet period in which it could actually take off. The innovation of groundwater use was very primitive at that stage because there wasn't electrification or anything else. So if they had tried that and we had had the climate of the previous century, we would have been in trouble. So at a very macro level, when you think about climate change, I think a reflection on what climate has meant to the place is the first point, and that's what I wanted to drive home. Our ability to predict the monsoon and its variations continues to be weak. So I think what we have to do is, instead of focusing on climate change scenarios where we are not making progress beyond conceptual ideas of what it would do, is to think about the range of climates that you could be exposed to. What does that mean in terms of practice? And that's where the groundwater depletion becomes particularly significant, because this is your stock and you're in an environment that faces very high fluctuation year to year, decade to decade, century to century. You have to have the stock to buffer you. We are at a time in India where all of a sudden, thanks to the global West getting unhappy with China, we are diverting a lot of resources to India to become an alternative manufacturing center. As a result, India is getting wealthier. There are more people making more money. That's translated into a shocking 97% of the population reporting they are now non-vegetarians, from probably something which was less than 20%. And these people are consuming A to Z fried chicken, according to pictures that you see. So the resource consumption is going up, not even counting the resources needed by the new factories and the new industry that is going to be coming in. Can one turn this into a story where the influx of cash translates into more efficient and more reliable resource use? Reliability here is key, because what most people talk about is, on average, what water is available, on average, what water is being used. And frankly, in terms of paying for it, that's hardly relevant, because you are never paying for water. You're paying for the fact that it is coming to you in a pipe. You're paying for the fact that it is clean. You're paying for the fact that it is there when you need it. And people understand that. So much of the issues in India with payment, people will not pay for water, are really related to the reliability aspect. And if we could solve that in terms of a positive action, so this is a positive statement saying, I will provide you this resource with this reliability. The equation that, hey, this is given to us by God and it falls out of the sky is changed. And I think that, at a very macro level, is the change in thinking that we need. And I think the time is perhaps right, because all these resources that are coming in, they're going to compete for that resource. And that competition could go in this direction or go to complete ruin. My hope is it goes in this direction.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And I'm also glad you didn't just give us like a kind of simple list of climate impacts. You're actually talking about systems and processes that are happening. One of the things I really took away from what you're saying about the willingness for people to essentially invest back into their governance, right? Is maybe the other part of what Veena's talking about too, that it's not just that politicians are seeing that there's this electorate that there is a strong interest in water, that they actually, they're turning back up towards the politicians and say, we really need it to be steady. We need it to make sure that you're not just giving us something, but that we can count on it in the future. I mean, it's interesting, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, actually said something kind of similar about 2 years ago. He said, we have to stop talking in California about how we're gonna do with 5% less water next year. That actually the issue is California needs to still be seen as a water abundant economy, so that new investment keeps coming here, that people keep seeing this as a place to live. And that's not a theoretical issue, as you also point out. The Harappan civilization, for instance, it's not well known, I think, as a civilization. Same era as the great civilizations in China and the Yellow and the Yangtze, or the Egyptian civilization on the Nile, but we can't translate their language, and they were very much based on the Indus, the kind of greater India, but like a truly vibrant civilization. And our best inference right now is that they failed several thousand years ago because of minor climate-driven shifts in the monsoon and the larger water and climate cycle. So there actually is precedent for large shifts that are happening. So Rochi, I wanted to ask you an introductory question. So your position, I think, is fascinating, especially if you kind of think over the 20th century. There's a transition that India really made from a kind of state-based economy to this incredibly vibrant private sector in South Asia generally, but especially in India. And you've been kind of living that lifestyle. So I'm curious, like, what do you see as some of the opportunities in that kind of public-private interface that have been evolving in recent years in India?
Thanks, John. And some of the opportunities are actually linked to some of the challenges. So just building off of what Veena and Manu were saying, and again, for those of you who are not familiar with the context, so India has 18% of the world's population, only 4% of the world's water resources. And we did some analysis which showed that by the year 2030, there's projected to be a 50% gap between water demand and water supply. Now, this is already playing out locally in many areas, so this is at an aggregate level. But that's a huge gap. 50% of demand would not be met by supply. Now, we know the story of increasing demand and shrinking supply, right? So increasing demand through population growth, urbanization, industrialization. I think my fellow panelists already spoke to that. And then shrinking supply through over-abstraction of groundwater, climate change, but also pollution. So whatever existing resources we have are also not always fit for productive use because of pollution and lack of wastewater treatment. So that's one part of the problem. Now it gets more complicated. There's high levels of non-revenue water within the system. So even if you augment supply, but you're losing 50, 60% of that water in distribution, you're not solving the problem. And then if you look at a lot of the tier one, the bigger cities, many of them are already water insecure. So Bangalore faces, for example, episodes of water crises. Chennai can only meet half of its demand through supply, and it relies 25%, of its demand comes through water tankers. So there's a whole economy around that, and you end up paying more because of the informal system that exists. So these are, challenges that are rampant across the country. Now, if we come to agriculture, and Veena already spoke to sort of 80% of water being used in agriculture, there are perverse incentives for farmers because you have free electricity, you have diesel, which is subsidized, you have fertilizers, which are subsidized. Then even what is being grown, there is a huge virtual trade of water. So you have, in some of the most groundwater stressed areas, you have crops like rice growing, which are not only for domestic consumption, but they're being exported. So how do you change the political economy to be able to deal with some of these challenges. And then tariffs. So there are very low tariffs across the board, but why would you pay for water if it's not being provided, right? So that's a whole fundamental question of improving services leads to better willingness to pay and also then the ability for consumers to contribute towards financial sustainability. And then on the political economy side, the way the system runs is you have the bureaucracy, which has a tenure of only 3 or 4 years at most. Oftentimes, 6 months to 24 months. So there is no continuity in sort of policy making and implementation. So all of these challenges present sort of the flip side of opportunity as well. So looking at how you can professionalize the sector, how do you look at technical and operational efficiency, addressing non-revenue water reduction, looking at irrigation, climate smart technologies. But I think it's really going down to the root causes of the water challenge and addressing those before coming really to the opportunity space.
A lot of depth in sensitivity, I think, in the issues that you raised, Rochi. Non-revenue water is the water that it's not paid for, right? So often we think about it as largely leaks, just to make sure that we're level set on that term. But in listening to you, Rochi, I'm struck by kind of 2 ideas. One is like a rice agriculture, that's probably relatively low profit. It's not necessarily smart from a kind of economic investment perspective, right? Like maybe there should, if we're going to export our water, maybe we should do it in something that actually has a larger return. And is that part of the kind of incentive structure that you're thinking about?
And yeah, so part of the conversation around whether or not rice is, the conversation is farmer-centric. So it's not just about switching out of rice. It's to say, how do we engage with the farmer to offer cropping choices that do not impact the farmer's income while still being water efficient? And it goes to the question of incentives, right? So if you're talking about cropping systems where the farmer is taking a hit in terms of livelihoods and incomes, that's not sustainable, and it's not going to work. So in some of the northern states where there is heavy rice cultivation, that's the conversation we're having. And I have to say there is willingness on the part of the government to think through the problem and possible solutions. So this is not new to them. The fact that groundwater tables are going down rapidly, the fact that in 20 years there may not be any groundwater to grow rice or anything else. So unless we're solving the problem now, it's already too late. And today is already too late to be thinking about this. But providing an alternative rather than only saying not this. But yeah, higher value, water efficient cropping systems and creating an ecosystem around that, which is also where private sector comes in, because private sector can provide some of the climate smart technology, can provide what we call, public-private community partnerships. So not just looking at public-private or private community, but creating those kinds of models that bring the different stakeholders together.
I'm also curious, maybe both you and Manu have talked about this kind of combination between efficiency and reliability, but you're also talking about, we're walking down a tunnel and there's a bright light. It is a train and it's pretty close now. And there are big changes that are going to happen. And I also wonder, efficiency is, it's a traditional approach to how we should think about water use. But there are limits to efficiency, right? And efficiency may not be resilience. Like if we're starting to add backup systems, we're thinking about sourcing water from multiple sources, aquifers, as well as rivers, maybe circular economy. We're trying to bring other kinds of water sources. Maybe we need like actually some non-efficient systems that actually result in reliability, but they may not be strictly speaking efficient. So that to me seems like are we on the edge of maybe a transition and how we kind of think about investing and managing water as an economic driver?
Yeah, so indeed, John, efficiency and resilience are 2 different things. I think resilience also looks at redundancy, right, in the system to be able to deal with situations as perhaps different from how history has played out, or the historical perspective. And I think that uncertainty is the parallel to resilience, in saying that we don't know what the future scenario is going to be, and that's why we need more resilient systems. But when I think of resilience, it's not only in infrastructure. So I think of resilience also in incentives, in institutions, in the way that we communicate. So it's being able to adapt to a situation. I think part of the challenge in India is heavy reliance on engineering, and the way that we're just going to build an infrastructure solution and work our way out of that. It's very much about diversifying water supply sources, looking at reuse, circular economy solutions, where the case might be, even looking at desalination, if it's energy efficient, and if the cost economics work out. So not in every case, of course. So it's very much about diversification, but I think it goes beyond just infrastructure as a solution for me.
It's a great answer, and maybe Veena, like that. It also seems that part of Well Labs, you're working on data. You're also working on science, and I'd say arguably like the most important data that we need is actually the data that we're never going to get. It's the data from the future that actually would tell us what we're headed for. So how do we manage that? How do we think about this issue around uncertainty and make sure that we're bringing in these resilience perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good set of points that both Manu and Rochi made about that there is, and this trade-off between resilience and efficiency is very, very well established. I think that I just wanted to say one thing before I answer your data question, if you don't mind. Manu talked about this idea, and actually both of them talked about this idea, and I call this the quantity for reliability trade-off. So one problem that we have in India is that we grow rice in particular in places which are very, very dry. Partly in Canal Command areas, classically you grow it because you don't have control over the water. So the water comes, the only crop that will deal with being flooded once every 15 days and then nothing for the other 15 days is paddy. And so farmers therefore grow paddy. They grow it also because there's a minimum support price, because the government encourages it. And if you actually want to move out of it, you actually need to have reliability. So you need to get the water when you want. You also need to get the markets in place so that you can sell the oranges or the chilies or the groundnuts or something other than that, which doesn't have a minimum support price. Now, to your question about data, I think that you're absolutely right. One of the big problems that we have with this entire situation of why we are suboptimal in what we grow and how we use it is we don't have enough data about all of the things we do, but particularly we don't have data on how we use water. So we have, as Manu said, we have, thanks to the British perhaps, a long history of rainfall and how much water is coming in. Still not enough in terms of gauging and monitoring of ground and surface water, but you have nothing at all on the other end of it, which is how much are we actually using? And that's kind of the crux. If you wonder, you can only manage what you measure, and if you're not measuring how much we use, we can't manage what you use. I think that we are beginning to see, thanks to India's dominance also in the software sector, a lot of interest on the part of the government as well as new initiatives in terms of measuring from space, in terms of low-cost sensing, so that we can get better data. And we're not there yet, but I think you will see a revolution in the next 20 years of just how we use data, collect more data, and then use data better through AI, ML type of technology, so that we can actually at least start by estimating who's using how much, when and for what, and then that is the first step in saying how we start managing it better.
Being able to see more, we'll be able to do more. I want to remind the audience, we're about to get ready for some questions. There's a QR code here or on your screen if you're tuned in remotely. We welcome your questions, and we'll turn to that in a minute. But Manu, I'd like to ask you, it feels like we're not just talking about issues that to me actually resonate very much. The story you're talking about, this kind of dry land, water-intensive irrigated farming, that could be the Imperial Valley, right? It could also be other aquifer-dependent parts of the U.S. It could also be China. Like, who are the kind of analogs that we need to be thinking about as the kind of peers in this water resilient space globally, but that we can pull lessons from?
Wow. I would say we are globally screwed, is the first answer. But the thing is that India is many climates and many geographies. So in a sense, for each place, there's an analog. And I was reflecting on the points Veena was making right in the beginning about the contrast with the US. In a fundamental way, I don't think there are that many differences. The biggest difference that I used to think was there was the procurement and distribution system of India, which is the largest contract farming operation in the world. And so that fixes the behavior of the farmers and hence the water use. But the Crop Insurance Act in the US has done exactly that. So there's really no difference. There are leverage points that the government's put in place that actually have been destructive. I think what I would do is, in terms of the question that you asked about what are the analogs that we learn lessons from, we don't have great lessons available, is the first point. The second thing is that, similar to what Rochi was saying earlier, these discussions always turn into, should we do A or B or C? And there are arguments made for each one of those things. Invariably, in a place like India that is, at this point, severely constrained in many aspects, my answer is, it seems to me you have to do A plus B plus C plus D, because there's none of those solutions individually will get somewhere. So when you say that, the next question that comes is, okay, what's your proposal for a relative investment in A, B, C, and D? And I think the answer to that is going to be very situation dependent. There's no global paradigms for that. What you do see as behavior is that anybody who's in politics or anybody who's an investor will focus on the supply side rather than on the demand side, because they feel that changing human behavior is difficult. So I'll give you an example from something I heard at the Aspen Institute 2 weeks ago or last week. I can't keep track of my life. And you'll see why I'm making that statement. So there was an individual who shall remain nameless for now, but he talked through what he's doing as an innovation, and the innovation was sketched as follows, and I'll use 2 of his 5 examples. The first example was that they've gone and installed, I forget how many thousand hand pumps in Rwanda, and since they are hand pumps and are not diesel powered, he was able to get carbon credits for these, and these actually paid for much more than that. And I was thinking, okay, well, whatever. And then this next example was that there's a lot of nitrogen emissions from wastewater treatment plants in Colorado. And he's made a map of how those plus various activities that happen in the stream lead to a much more significant carbon impact. So he's been able to get, he estimated this at, I think, 70,000 tons per month or something like that, and he got $40 a ton for this. And what was interesting was that he got this so that cash up front, so that the wastewater treatment plants can get these payments up front to file for wastewater treatment improvement permits. There's no verification, you just get the money. And the other examples were similar, and my reaction was, you know what, this is very interesting, and my comment to him was, I am wearing the same clothes that I bought 20 years ago. I basically am a minimalist. I minimize consumption. Why am I missing out? Can you please coach me so that I can get all these carbon credits and I can retire and live happily forever after? And so behavior change would not be so hard if you pass the incentives to me rather than to some other guy. And this person wasn't happy with my saying that, of course. But as I thought more about it, I was thinking, actually, he is a genius, because he's taken a current movement which generates the finances that are needed to create improvements in something you're interested in, and he has done that. Why am I complaining about this? He truly is a genius. So I approached him again and I said, okay, 10%. Anything you should not be consuming that you are consuming, I'll promise not to consume, verifiable. Send me the money and I'll give you 10% of the money. I think that really is what we need to be thinking about, is because societal investments are driven more by those kind of paradigms than they are driven by rational arguments.
Well, I think that that idea that that we need to be aware of how, in effect, like what are the real drivers in how people make decisions is maybe we're at a moment in India right now. This sense that big things have happened, that we're on the edge of bigger things that are about to happen. And Rochi, I'd like to ask a question to you that came through. We have the track of population growth, but also economic, not just growth, but really economic transformation that's happening in India. And one of the things I really admire about the World Bank is that, especially over the last 15 years or so, the World Bank tries to step back a little bit and take a bigger picture, say like, this is not just an investment in an asset, we're actually investing in a society, in a culture. We're trying to think also long-term with the decision makers that are there. What does that governance system look like? What is the water economic governance, maybe water economic ecosystem governance system that we need to be thinking about to be resilient in India right now?
So in terms of governance, I would start by
No pressure on the answer either.
Yeah, sure. In terms of just governance, I would still say that the government is the primary entity responsible for water resources management in any country, right? So it's really up to the government to put in place the policies, institutions, regulations, the governance mechanisms that drive efficiency, financial sustainability, economic viability, resilience, and to draw in the private sector and others, into that space. So if we're talking only, let's say, private sector, and that's the hat I wear, but in the absence of a strong governance framework, even the private sector cannot operate. And if there are any investors and financial institutions in the room, you would say we're not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole because the governance is so weak. So I think it's even if we talk about a PPP, a public-private partnership, the first P in that is public. Then you get to private. And I always say it's not just PPP, but it's a PPCP, where the C is for community. And you need, the community very squarely involved. So I think from a governance standpoint more generally, and this feeds into economics and finance, it's really about allowing the space and creating the enabling conditions and the reforms that are needed for private sector and others to engage. And just to say, it's not rocket science. And we had a rover on the moon, so we've reached the moon, but we haven't solved some of the basic issues in terms of water. So hopefully we can get there.
It's a great answer. A good colleague of mine from the bank, his definition for resilience is more informed trade-offs. And I think that's one of the ideas that's implicit in your statement. We have a question here, I think, and then we'll move on to the second part. If you could, sir, please say your name and your affiliation. There you go.
Hello, yes, now, thank you. My name is Gonzalo Pizarro, and I work at the United Nations. I have a question. I mean, Manu, you mentioned the idea of thinking of the scenarios that you would be building on the context of climate change. But if we add the other drivers to which you have been talking about, urbanization, industrialization, the movement, not only industrialization, but moving into the service industry, the software, etc., data centers that are energy intensive and therefore water intensive as well. How do you think that is changing the landscape in terms of the potential scenarios and the directions that you would drive, which once you make decisions, you lock resources, you put infrastructure in place, and that gives a direction, at least for some period of time, but also changes the political landscape?
Yeah, one of the paradigms that someone explained to me once was water flows to the money, right? And that's what I was signaling in the beginning, is that that's starting to become an issue specifically for these countries that are rapidly economizing now. But that creates extreme vulnerability for people who will then be denied those resources. And that's the lock-in that concerns me almost more than the climate scenarios. There are easy safeguards to put in place there so that we don't end up with large-scale riots everywhere. India is particularly interesting because Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola have already gone through that kind of a scenario. And, you know, traditionally what companies like that did is create offsets in some way so that they could still have a license to operate in that particular environment. I think the situation in India has reached a point where that's not, I mean, it's still going to happen, but that's not going to be a large-scale solution overall. India does need to improve its economy, and industrialization is definitely one of the pathways associated with that. If you look at food production in India, which is the big water user, it's easy to see that with sufficient inputs, and Rochi may be able to speak to this better from a World Bank perspective, the efficiency with which resources are used in agriculture, even if that sees modest improvements, the amount of water that is liberated in the process for other uses is substantial. To build on the point I was making earlier, I think as groundwater levels deepen, this becomes even a stronger story, that if you look at the cost of electricity for that pumping that is going to the farmer that is pumping, that number is quite a bit smaller than the carbon credits that they could harvest for getting that offset, okay? So I think that thinking more in a market framework as to how different people can be incentivized to improve their productivity in the process of new economies coming in is the policy goal. But you know, I say that with some trepidation because all policy instruments are invariably subject to capture, and that's what we see more of. But conceptually, that's my answer.
Fantastic. We're going to move now to really trying to talk about some of the solutions that have been emerging around climate resilience. I'm going to start with Veena, and no break. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, saddle up. Yeah, the previous session ran a little long, so I've been signaled that we're in this for the duration. So you mentioned, what was the number about the amount of water in India that was in agriculture?
I said it was about 80%.
About 80%. So that's, to give like a North American perspective, that's around Mexico. About 80% of Mexico's water goes to agriculture. In the U.S., about 50% of our water goes to energy. That's the kind of largest single area that we spend, in effect, our water on. But also, like, economies are dynamic. It's not just the climate that's changing. It's really that we see a lot of things that are changing. So socially, politically, India is a dynamic place just like the U.S. And for instance, in the U.S., there was a story in the Washington Post just a few days ago that the AI-generated letter or resume roughly consumes this much water in the U.S. And that's impressive. So we're restructuring our economy through things like data centers and AI processing centers. And that is taking water away from other places that we may not be able to see it. And my intuition is India's future economy is not necessarily 80% water in agriculture. It's going to be a lot more water in new and emerging areas. And certainly India is a real leader in issues around data centers, data analysis, and AI. I'm curious, like, what do you see as some of these kinds of emerging solutions to not just help capture our resilience to climate change, but also to the kind of economic transformation that India may be going through?
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree, firstly, that the future distribution of water use is not going to be 80%, although I did see projections where they are expecting agriculture to also increase, but other sectors of the economy are going to increase even faster. Now, the question you're asking is if you're already kind of distressed, where's that extra water going to come from? I don't know the answer to this because when I look at some of these reports and I wonder how they're projecting everything to increase, I don't know where they imagine the water is going to come from in those scenarios that we've seen. However, what we are already we are seeing a few different trends. The first thing I think is, we've talked about crop shifting and changing the mix of stuff that's grown, and there's many parts of India which have had tremendous success in getting large-scale government purchases of millets, for example, instead of rice. So it's really difficult to get farmers to grow something else if they don't know there's a market. But the government starts procuring it for midday meal programs and so on. That's changing the relative economics. Then suddenly you are going to start seeing large-scale shifts from the more water-intensive to. So some of it is going to come from us getting our calories from less water-intensive stuff, whether it's the way we grow rice and just to be more efficient in the way we grow rice, or shift the mix from rice to millets. Some of it's going to come from there. Some of it is going to come from, right now, sewage is bad, and environmental bad, in the sense that Indian cities are using water, and 80% of that water is returning as sewage, and it's rendering water bodies unusable because they're now so eutrophied and polluted. And one trend that you are seeing, a positive trend, is that you're seeing investments in some of these water-intensive users from industry coming in saying, we'll buy sewage and we'll mine the sewage for water, and we'll make the investment in wastewater treatment. And you're beginning to see some of that. There are good examples with Arvind Mills, for example, which is a big apparel company which produces for Gap and some of these other big denim companies. They, in one city, bought up entire streams of sewage. In my own city, in Bangalore, one of the companies, BEL, which is an electronics company, signed a deal with, but it's a public sector electronics company, but they signed a deal with the government municipality saying, we'll build the wastewater treatment plant, we get to keep 20% of the water, and 80% goes back into the river. So by making investments in water that is dirty, which was 100% unusable, you're kind of creating some leeways there. And then the last bit of where you are probably going to see that extra water coming is just moving from drier places to wetter places. So there's been a lot written about, like, the western part of India, like the US, is dry. The eastern part is relatively wet. And one of the things where a lot of people have written about is what they call the new green revolution in the East, saying stop growing wet, water-intensive and doing water-intensive stuff in the dry places and start doing it in the wet places. So I think broadly, this is where the magic of somehow creating extra water has got to come from.
That makes a lot of sense. I think on one hand, you're talking about actually seeing new value in water itself, and people seeing an opportunity in that. It's a very promising idea, but also saying, actually, we need to make some pretty big structural changes. And there's in a country the size of India, the scale of India, we need to think almost about our own kind of internal geopolitics and how we're moving parts of our economy around to places that actually match either the current or emerging climate. I'm going to turn to Rochi now too, kind of on a similar point. From your perspective, are there investment opportunities or are there new programs or policies that you see that are holding promise? A little bit after Manu was talking, such a dark view, I was considering that maybe cannibalism could be a potential option. We're considering it in Oregon right now, actually, with some of our water issues. But maybe you have some more positive views.
Yeah, and let me make this more tangible than just theoretical. So I think there are opportunities in terms of wastewater treatment and circular economy solutions. In fact, as the World Bank we worked on a program for the cleanup of the Ganga River. And it was through a new public-private partnership model where essentially the private sector mobilizes 100% of the investment upfront and is paid or reimbursed 40% of that at the end of construction, and the balance 60% over a 15-year concession period. And the reason that we developed this structure, it's a hybrid annuity model, as we call it, is that there was a lot of infrastructure development in the country where you had construction of assets, but no operations and maintenance. And so it was a cycle of build, neglect, rebuild, and it became a vicious circle of just pouring a lot of money into capital investments without making use of those. So I think that's a space just in general. This is an example from the Ganga Basin, but it cuts across other areas. A second example, and building off of your last question, is around digital. So we, for example, developed a water accounting framework for the country, similar to financial accounts for those of you who are familiar with that world. You have a cash flow statement, a balance sheet. It's very easy to understand and easy to absorb. So doing that, but for water, using satellite imagery. And ground truthing that for triangulation of data. So that's a second area. I think digital offers tremendous opportunity. There's also now technology, AI for leakage detection, asset optimization. You can look at machine learning algorithms, and we've done some of this. Again, speaking to Veena's point, in the textile sector as well, looking at IoT meters for real-time water quality monitoring and feeding that into dashboards where you can measure and manage water use within textiles as an example, but it cuts across other areas. So that's the second space I would say is the digital piece. A third area is around climate-smart agriculture and irrigation. So looking at new kinds of technologies that could be adopted within agriculture. Part of it is just improved practices, right? We don't need flooding of rice fields or just flood irrigation in general. There's very basic technology that you can even adopt for sort of just drip irrigation, micro irrigation, sprinkler systems that dramatically reduce the water requirement. But then you can couple that with other types of technology, and so that's a huge space. So we've been working on this in different states. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state in India, working with 1 million farmers in switching them to more water efficient cultivation. So I think there's a range of opportunity. One last example I would give is the government of India has recently asked the World Bank to support water security for 100 cities. And this is going to look at water supply, sanitation, solid waste management across some of the biggest cities in the country. And it's not just looking at traditional public procurement and public sector-driven infrastructure, but also bringing in the private sector, and particularly looking at private capital mobilization, because we know that public resources are insufficient to solve the problem. So what kinds of models and bankable structures can be created to bring in the private sector into this? So, yeah. That's really interesting. I think we'll come back to finance and funding as maybe a final topic. That's a really urgent one. But I'm curious about, you mentioned like a number of kind of data products. Who are they aimed at? Who are some of the kind of target audiences? You're trying to reach individual farmers? You're trying to maybe come to river basin organizations or other like legislators or other regulators? Who is it that you're focused on there? All of the above. Okay. And I think data has tremendous potential to drive change. And depending on the context, so if you're working in agriculture and you empower farmers with data, they will take the right decisions. If they know, how to work on irrigation scheduling, how to look at precipitation patterns. I mean, and we're doing some of this on the field, and there's a lot of innovation happening around reducing the cost of access for farmers to data and technology. So that's another space where there's tremendous opportunity, but huge gains to be made because you see that the farmer is also a rational agent at the end of the day. The farmer is trying to maximize profits, and if there's a way of doing that with data as an enabler, absolutely. And similarly, working on data access for the industrial sector. So I mentioned the textile sector. So we had some of the global retailers reach out and say, we're sourcing from factories in South Asia. So this cuts across India and Bangladesh and other places in East Asia as well. But we don't know, the water footprint of these factories. And we have these goals to be more sustainable. But how do we engage with these factories and improve their water and carbon footprint without really understanding what's going on? And so that's where, the IoT meters came in. We developed dashboards that provided a view of factory-level water footprints both to the retailer as well as the factory themselves, because oftentimes they also didn't have a sense of what is the real water footprint. And you have a lot of factories, some of you may be familiar, in South Asia where there is poor enforcement of effluent coming out of these factories. So whenever you have someone coming to check whether or not you're in compliance with the water quality requirements and discharge standards, they turn on their effluent treatment plant, and when the officer leaves, they turn it back off just to save on cost. So when you create data transparency, that can drive huge dividends in terms of improvement in water footprints.
That's really interesting. Manu, I think a lot of what we've heard are about how we address especially kind of current climate impacts. They could be over short time scales, like I need to harvest next week, or I need to think about the reliability of the monsoon this year, one of the projections for it. But we also need to think about maybe longer time scales too. Piece of infrastructure, can last decades, centuries. And how do we think about making sure that those investments, even a governance system too, can last centuries? How do we think about investing in those and new insights there in a way that helps us really get ready for the kind of emerging futures?
Yeah, so India actually in the recent period, from what I read, has done a spectacular job on building highways, for example, and changing laws that allow goods to be transported across state lines without paying a tax at every single crossing, right? So these things allow connectivity and so forth. And so the question is, how do you replicate that in water with the changing climate looking forward? Some things are relatively easy to anticipate. So if you look in the Himalayan sector, the fact that you're going to have depletion of glaciers, the fact that you're going to have, as a result, a change in the natural vegetation in those areas and in the soil conditions, these are things that are easy to plan for. And the reason I mentioned the roadways and so forth to begin with is because where a strategic interest is clear, the deployment of capital becomes very easy to do. Where the strategic interest is not clear, we can talk all about what could be, and we don't do that. So if we now get away from that, it's actually much harder because India, like the US, faces an interesting challenge in a lot of aging dams that are probably a hazard. And the government in India seems to be more aware of that than the government in the US, so that's actually a positive. And the government in India has had an interest in building these interlinking canals to capture all the water everywhere and so forth. I think that in the spirit of what I said earlier, which is A plus B plus C plus D, some of this actually has to be done through with central planning at the central government level, not at the local levels. And so in that sense, the fact that India at least has a framework for doing national planning is superior to what we see in the US. A place which has done a very interesting job of these kind of innovations, which are climate smart, but really they are more about reducing the risk associated with water, both quantity and quality, is China. And so while China still has probably a ways to go, they have built south to north canals, which is what India aspires to do. They have built sponge cities, which is the nature-based solution for urban stuff. They have built significant capacity in wastewater treatment plants to reuse. So, all of these come from the fact that there is central planning that is driven by a strategic policy. So I think the biggest message I have is that if India were to straighten out what their strategic policy is, and the same applies to the US, then you can actually talk about which climate threats. Is it floods? What is the solution for floods at the landscape scale? What's the solution for floods at the urban scale? Becomes a tractable question. When you do not have a strategy and you talk about all the climate threats, you cannot formulate a strategy for what to do. So I think the first order is to basically attack that problem. Having said that, the other bigger constraint in India relative to the US is land. Land is not really available for many of these things. It would be a takings, and that's where the social construct comes in a bigger way. So I think what has to happen in India, going back to the earlier points that all of us were making effectively, is your question was, what about the future? And so this is the demand side again, rather than the supply side on water. So work we did a decade or so ago, which is not as fresh as what Veena and Rochi have been looking at that time, the claim was that around 85 to 90% of the water in India was being used for agriculture. We, based on improvements in where the crops are grown and the efficiency of irrigation, we were assuming that fully irrigated agriculture is more beneficial from a reliability perspective than rainfed agriculture for any crops which are sensitive to that. So if you were thinking of millet, which would just grow naturally and the yields would not be significantly affected, we didn't count that. So if you did that, we got around a 40% reduction in water use. So that brings us down to 56 from 90. However, the fact is that, as I said earlier, if you start now converting to a non-vegetarian diet and you count of increasing population and increasing affluence, which leads to higher consumption of all products, that brings us back to 70% from 56. So it's really, the point I'm trying to make is that it's really important not to just think about the climate piece, because the solution space on what you can do is actually the same, no matter what your climate projections are. So you have to really think in terms of what your ability to act there is. And so if you now say, it's 80%, then some of that has already been priced in effect. I have not seen a significant movement in agricultural water use in gross terms. So I think that opportunity is still there. And from a climate perspective, the things that Rochi was mentioning, some of these things can be brought to scale, but unless the value proposition associated with those investments is very clear and tangible, it will not happen.
Well, what I hear you saying is we need a clear vision about what is the art of the possible here, and we need to be able to see, to make strategic decisions, probably through some kind of a central but accountable governance system that says we need to view water essentially as our asset for resilience at an economic level.
I mean, I can give some more precise answers on this as well. One of the things I've seen in the Western US and in India is, we are going to do managed aquifer recharge, and we are going to really put the water back in the ground. Do a back of the envelope calculation. What difference are you going to make over what time scale? Is this really one of the options? If you're going to build these canals for connectivity, have you looked at the concurrence of drought in the two areas? So if you're building the canal with the idea that this is the surplus area and this is a deficit area, and you connect them and they both go into drought, that's not doing you any good.
Well, I would argue that one of the key insights of resilience thinking is describing systems, right? And understanding how the system as a whole is operating. And I think that's at the heart of what you're talking about.
Can I add an amendment, though, to what Manu said? I don't think he meant necessarily centralized planning. I don't think that's what he... But it is true that what China has is because you have a centralized government that can therefore drive everybody to act in concert. Therefore, all of the issues of the left-hand side not knowing the right-hand side, and we can give a dozen examples of that in India and the US. But I think that doesn't need centralized planning. It just needs better connection of the dots or better coordination.
Yeah.
Centralized goal setting.
Goal setting, yeah. And somebody needs to basically, make everybody then align that behind that goal, yeah.
So we already have some questions that have come up that are along those lines, but I want to spend at least a couple of minutes on the finance side. And Rochi, I'd like to ask you, like, what do you see? We're really talking about asking more from water. India, for instance, with SDG 6, with the SDG that's focused especially on water and sanitation, has set really high ambitions for the country in terms of improving access, improving healthcare outcomes. More generally, if there's a rapid investment in energy systems, again, many of which are intensely water dependent, and then thinking about say sponge cities, an idea that Upmanu raised, that those don't pay for themselves, right? We actually we probably need to think about new ways to actually mobilize, maybe to use to reference the previous comments. We need to align our goals, but we also need to align the finance. And I wonder, do you see some new patterns that are starting to emerge in the finance space?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm going to share perhaps some sobering statistics to begin with. So the amount of investment needed globally to meet the water SDGs is $1 trillion a year. And current annual spending in the sector is to the tune of 160 billion. So we're already quite short in terms of existing resources that are being put to water globally. Only 1.2% of annual public budgets are going to water. More is being spent on transport, military expenditures, etc. So water is still not being prioritized, even though we see deficits emerging, scarcity, pollution, climate change impacts. And climate change manifests primarily in terms of water, right? Too much flooding, too little droughts, tsunamis and what have you. But we're still not seeing that kind of change within the space to get more capital flowing to water. That's one. Within this existing allocation, let's say 160 billion that's going to the water sector, 91% of that is public sector funded. And there are limitations to fiscal resources. So unless we get private capital to flow to this, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. Public and concessional resources are insufficient to be able to deal with the water challenge. I mean, I think that's just a sobering reality, but it's important to internalize to then start to think, okay, so if that's the case, then how do we get private capital? And on private capital, liquidity is not the constraint. There is enough capital out there, but it's not flowing to the water sector. So, okay, then you might ask, okay, how do we get that capital to flow to water? And it goes towards foundational issues. It's about having creditworthy utilities and service providers, having bankable projects, better pricing, improved incentives in the sector. So just going back to basics in terms of improving those fundamental issues to get the capital to flow. Now, there is a step in between. One is sort of, creating these enabling conditions where the government has to play a role. And then there is this, let's say, third step of private capital flowing. There is a step in between, which I like to call professionalizing the sector, which is where you address losses, you look at more technical efficiency, you look at energy efficiency. There's a huge water energy nexus that can be addressed. Getting in digital solutions to better manage water. So there's this huge space where we can turn around how water overall is managed across different subsectors. And once we do that, then we start to move towards creditworthiness and bankability, and where we start to see private capital coming in. So in terms of new approaches, etc., some of what we are also doing now is to say, how do we change how existing resources are also used? So ensuring efficiency in the use of public resources so that you're getting the right kinds of outcomes, but also strategic use of public resources for de-risking. So if you have layers of risk which are preventing private sector from engaging, can you, instead of using public resources just for capital subsidies, use it for interest rate subvention? Can you look at guarantees and credit enhancement instruments with public support rather than, again, plain vanilla investments going in? And that's the space where I think a lot of innovation is already happening. And I can share maybe a couple of examples from different parts of the world where we've done this. And again, some of this is also working in India. So in Jordan, which is, again, a very water-stressed country, we worked on a wastewater treatment plant. And again, for debt and equity investment to come in, it was too risky. So we had the sovereign come up with a guarantee instead of just providing capital budget support to be able to crowd in equity investors. And then we also had a breach of contract guarantee coming in from the World Bank's multilateral investment guarantee agency to be able to get debt capital to flow. So creating these kinds of structures can have an impact in terms of the outcome, but also in terms of more private capital. And then one more example, which I'll share, is from Indonesia, which is where we engaged with a number of water utilities, and there were obviously at different levels of performance. And so we structured support to those utilities to say, if you're a poor performing utility, you get a one-time seed grant or a capital investment support program to be able to improve your performance. If you're a mid-tier utility, you get performance-based financing to be able to move up the ladder. And if you're a top performing utility, you get a matching grant if you're able to tap commercial debt and capital markets. So being able to then provide that incentive for different service providers, depending on where they are, in their performance, can also help to create that incentive to move them along.
A great response. I have a initial question from the audience that I'm going to ask Veena, but I also welcome people here in the audience to get ready to ask your questions next. You might signal if you're interested in asking a question. But I wanted to pass on a question that I think is actually very relevant to the U.S. A lot of the issues around concern over climate impacts in the U.S. have really focused on climate justice, social justice issues. And India, like the US, also has a kind of long history of inequity, kind of systemic inequity, and it's also done admirable work in trying to improve that. But climate change, a dynamic climate, and especially expressed through the water cycle, makes it even harder, right? Like what does equity look like as to use a climate term, a non-stationary variable?
Yeah, I think it's easier to start with what inequity looks like, because I'll give you an example of one thing that's really concerning, which is with carbon offset projects. I saw a carbon offset project a few months ago in peri-urban Bangalore, where actually I saw a couple of them, where they were growing a Miyawaki forest, which is a very, very high density plantation. And this is in a dry place. So the only way you can keep that carbon offset project alive is by pumping groundwater. And groundwater in this place is at 1,000 feet. So you're now having a company buy up land from farmers, but because electricity is free, pumping groundwater from 1,000 feet to keep this high density plantation alive, which has no ecosystem services other than being a stock of carbon. It's not, providing animal habitat or any of that in its design. So I would say that there's a lot of problems, definitely a lot of problems in the way carbon tunnel vision is kind of where it's pushing climate financing to go to places that are not farmer friendly. Because and the other thing is that many of these carbon offset projects are actually require a minimum of 10,000 acres. If you have to go to any of the big financing companies, that's the number. The average farm size in India is 2 acres. So it's not going to the smallholder farmers, it's going to big people who can buy up large parcels of land, use the free electricity, and I would say pump groundwater, which is it's not only inequitable, it's actually probably not even carbon neutral to start with. So if you really want to be equitable, there have to be very clear mechanisms by which the money is going to the smallest, to actually the smallholder farmers, which requires a whole bunch of transaction costs. Can I say two things to respond to Rochi also? I just wanted to say two positive things about where I think the distant future, where I'm seeing green shoots. It's too early to say if these shoots are going to become trees or they're going to wither on the, on the ground. But one of them is what you're seeing with circularity. You're seeing really interesting investments coming in on the private side on circular systems where moving from wastewater treatment plants to resource plants. There's a couple in Sweden and Canada now where they're mining the phosphorus and selling the phosphorus, and they're from the sewage treatment. But this is then allowing the entire cost of investment in sewage treatment to fall very drastically because you're able to get this additional income stream. So I think there's that might change. It's too early to tell, but I think that might change. And the second thing is India just introduced a green credit system for companies to make investment in water replenishment or offset projects. There is a lot of blue washing in the offset space, but you are seeing some interesting investments also in positive, water replenishment, water treatment type of things by companies wanting to work outside the fence. So, and particularly the large tech companies, you're seeing them make these investments. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I would also add that maybe green climate bonds, which have been highly utilized in China, following Europe and the US, have not really been very much explored in India. It could be another similar path. Looks like we have a question here. If you could say your name and affiliation, please.
Hear me okay? Skelly Holmbeck, the Water Resources Association of the Delaware River Basin. We work with water users throughout the Northeast. And one of the biggest challenges is that our under-resourced utilities, and they can look all kinds of different ways. They struggle the most to find grants, understand how to pursue grants, do the things they need to do to find money, to manage that money, to manage those projects. So my question is, thoughts that you all have. We've put a funding navigator in place to help them, to some extent, find funding, but there's levels of complexity. You've got to find it. You've got to write the reports. You've got to manage the grant. Super complicated. So thoughts from you all about how to help those under-resourced utilities.
It's a powerful question, especially in the public sector with utilities. How do we mobilize the capacity and find the capital to invest in new kinds of capacities that we're asking for from utilities? Some thoughts.
Well, I mean, it boils down to basics in a way, and I don't know the specific context, of course, of what you're describing, but in terms of just utilities being able to tap capital, it's about getting to technical efficiency and financial sustainability of investments. So, how do you ensure, firstly, that you have adequate funding, through pricing mechanisms? Are there cash flows or revenue generating activities which can crowd in private capital? If not, addressing those key issues to then be able to draw in private capital over time. What we did see is that so we have this database called IBNet, which looks at utilities from around the world and captures data. What we did see is that if you address non-revenue water or water losses, if you look at increase in collections or billing, and if you reduce non-labor costs within the utility, all of a sudden, just by these three measures alone, you have a significant increase in creditworthiness of utilities and their ability to be able to go to capital and financial markets. So, I think it's again just going down to fundamentals and seeing, where is the gap? Is it a well-functioning utility with the kind of credit profile that can tap finance? And if not, are there measures such as these that can help it get there?
Maybe, I think I understand why Skelly's asking that. I think, Skelly, the challenge that I see is that you have to have an appropriate tax base, because it's not just the utilities, it's the operation of the municipal systems themselves that the utilities are associated with. And the typical rhetoric in the US is it's the fragmentation and we have too many utilities and there should be a way to share something. In the conversation that Rob was leading earlier, some of this was coming out. But fundamentally, one interesting thing is Ted Hennepin, who has taken over Jackson, Mississippi. I listened to one of his YouTube things just when he had taken over, and one proposal they were putting forward was that instead of having water rates, they proposed that they link a payment to the property taxes of each household. And what this does is it, of course, if it's structured properly, it takes the highest net worth individuals paying the most into the system, who probably also have the most luxury consumption, but it creates a base for funding. So I think that's one possible mechanism that could be brought into these things. People will resist that. All economists hate it because they want you to pay for what you use, but that's not happening anyway. The challenge that I see in the whole municipal space is the value of the services provided to the homeowners is never clear. And so the kind of things that these people are doing need to be made much more explicit and tied. The flip side of it is, if all of this continues as it is, all that responsibility shifts to the individual homeowner. And so that could be good or bad. In general, we think that that's a failure of the whole system, but it could be that that stimulates the $1,000 RO system becoming a $100 RO system, because now that's much more common. And right now, there are systems available for $10,000 to $20,000 that are at the domestic scale that go from wastewater to full reuse, a very high degree of filtration. So if you could drive those down to 1,000, and these are reuse systems, and now they could accept rainwater and other things, that totally changes the dimension of this, and the utility as it exists today would vanish. I'm not suggesting we go there, but I think that's a very interesting question to think about as to where does the responsibility of the homeowner lie, where does the responsibility of the utility lie, and how do you actually make that clear to both parties? Because that clarity is not there at the moment. They think that these are people who serve us, and somehow magically this stuff is supposed to appear. I'm not supposed to pay for it necessarily, So I think that equation has to change, and by making clear what they would have to do, what they would pay, and what they're responsible for, and the fact that the plumber will charge you $300 for showing up every single time, I think that communication absolutely needs to happen.
I'm going to throw in an answer too, but I'm also about to warn the panel that we're coming close to final statements. And I think Kelly was your name. Another potential answer actually is that I think is emerging from the climate community, not necessarily the water community. And you're especially focused on utilities like SMEs, the small, medium utilities. They're often very undercapacitated, and they're very much embedded in the water sector, but they're often disconnected from this kind of growing world that is starting to appear in climate. And that's true in the US as much as it is in India. And there's a whole new range of, I think, potential opportunities for climate finance. That actually, one of the particularities of the US is you can get a loan for capital expenses, but not for operating expenses. And the kind of capacity that you're talking about is all on that process side. It's all on the operating side. And so being able to mobilize climate finance often means that you need to start to talk to some new groups. You might need to talk to the climate teams inside of national authorities, that they're also talking to the Green Climate Fund or to the big MDBs, or in the US it might be special legislative authorities that are starting to work, or CEQ, groups like that. But being able to kind of reframe your water issues in a climate context, I think, is actually really powerful and important, especially for these small groups, and I think it's very much valid for both countries. But as a last point, I'd like, before we part ways, I wanted to ask each of the panelists, starting with Rochi, to talk about what are the one or two kind of big points in just a handful of sentences that you'd like the audience to be able to take away around India and water resilience?
Maybe just one sentence is, no single stakeholder can do it alone. I mean, that's been my recognition over the past few years working both in South Asia but elsewhere. I mean, I think in the water sector, I get asked a lot of, why private sector or, why government and vice versa. And I don't think it's a question of either or, it's and. I mean, we need everyone, we need to pool resources, and the challenge is so huge that we should have started yesterday. So yeah, I feel like we have to get to that space of collective action as soon as possible. Thanks.
Manu.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the energy transition. There's not as much of a talk about a water transition, but what is obvious but not advertised is that we are going through an entire social transition that is unmatched by anything we have seen historically. It's a data transition, it's a technology transition, but it's really a social transition. The connectivity between populations in India, the United States, and elsewhere is unprecedented. I am very optimistic, despite my sounding negative on most things. I think that as part of this social transition, we will evolve positively towards a positive social contract between peoples. And the divisiveness that we are seeing in politics in this country and elsewhere, and the emergence of absolutism in politics, I think this will give way to a much more saner society. So that's my optimistic note.
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't bring up cannibalism. So.
No, that was very positive. I think we have big problems, but we also have two positive things working in India's favor. One is, of course, the economy is growing really fast. And a lot of the development that's going to happen in the water sector is greenfield, particularly on the urban side, which means that we have the opportunity to redefine. I saw these 3 Ds that I saw in a report which said that this water transition that Manu just talked about is going to be governed by the 3 Ds, democratization, decarbonization, and digitalization, which I think that actually those 3 are actually going to define the system of the future. But I'm actually going to end agreeing with Rochi, because I think the single biggest thing that we need to do is working together or collaboratively for collective impact. Because as Manu also said, we can kind of have a goal, but if everybody is not working towards the goal together, pulling in the same direction, we're not going to get there. And I think if we can do that, then I think we can actually get to a pretty water secure future.
Very well said, thank you. And for myself, one of the most powerful experiences I had in my life was in India. It was about 12 years ago, and I was invited by some colleagues to visit a small town in the middle Ganges. And I actually went camping on an island in the Ganges. And I was swimming with Gangetic dolphins, one of the rarest species on the planet. And they literally would come up to me and I could feel them clicking in the water. It was unbelievable. These are also one of the most sacred species in the world. They're like really treasured by the peoples of South Asia. And like that's what it told me was water has a really deep value there. It's not just the language of economics and finance or infrastructure and governance that actually I have faith that India will do well, because it must do well, and it has this deeper layer to how they see the water in the country. So if we could thank our panel for their participation. And also, if we could thank the National Academies and the crack crew that was secretly managing me through, it was much better than artificial intelligence. It was real intelligence in the process. So thank you all.